right, so we are officially at the 100-day mark of Israel's genocidal campaign inside of the Gaza Strip. Just unbelievable carnage, death, destruction that has occurred over the last 100 days. Obviously, I've been closely tracking all of it on this channel and been trying to report on it as best as I can for you guys. And I got a bunch of different updates that I'm going to get to hopefully later today, sort of recapping the major stories over the weekend. But before we get to that, I just want to talk about a couple of different reports that came out over the last couple of weeks here on the abject failure of the US media, of the British media, international press, Western press, in their coverage of all of this so far. And this is obviously important, not just because, we want our media to be reporting on reality in a, objective way, but it's important because the media is what informs the people, right? And the people are what are able to actually apply pressure, at least hypothetically, on our political leaders and representatives, right? And so the way that they cover this is vitally important in terms of actually being able to have a check on the powerful. That's what a free press and a so-called democracy is supposed to do. There's supposed to be a check on the most powerful people and institutions and corporations in the world. And yet our media has been doing the exact precise opposite of that so far. So here, just to start off, a new article that came out a couple of days ago from The Intercept. Coverage of Gaza war in the New York Times and other major newspapers heavily favored Israel, according to their analysis that they did here. So they say, the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times coverage of Israel's war on Gaza showed a consistent bias against Palestinians, according to an Intercept analysis, right? They say the open source analysis focuses on the first 6 weeks of the conflict, so it's even still out of date. I think, honestly, as time has gotten, gone on, it's gotten egregiously worse. So if anything, this is probably understating the issue. But it says it's from October 7th, the Hamas attack that killed around 1,139 Israelis, about 700 of them being civilians and foreign workers, to November 24th of 2023. The beginning of the week-long humanitarian truce agreed to by both parties to facilitate hostage exchanges. During this period, almost 15,000 Palestinians, including more than 6,000 children, it's now over 11,000 children, and almost 30,000 civilians, were killed by Israel's bombardment of Gaza. Today, the Palestinian death toll is over 2,000, 22,000. That's a conservative estimate. That's, due to like the UN numbers and the Gaza Health Ministry not counting the people who are underneath the rubble and fairly presumably dead. The Euromed Human Rights Monitor, which does include that count, is up to almost 30,000 at this point. They say The Intercept collected more than 1,000 articles from the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times about Israel's war on Gaza and tallied up the usages of certain key terms and the context in which they were used. So, it's important to point out, these aren't even necessarily like conservative outlets. They are from my perspective as a socialist, right? But these are supposed to be like the mainstream papers, right? So we're not talking about like Breitbart. We're not talking about like the Daily Wire. These are supposed to be the hypothetically most objective papers in the US. They say the tallies reveal a gross imbalance in the way Israelis and pro-Israel figures are covered versus Palestinians and pro-Palestinian voices, with usages that favor Israeli narratives over Palestinian ones. The anti-Palestinian bias in print media tracks with a similar survey of U.S. cable news that the authors conducted last month for the column that found an even wider disparity. I'm going to show you that here in a second. They say, of course, the media's presentation of the conflict means that there are fewer political downsides to lockstep support for Israel, which is exactly what we have seen from the Biden administration so far. So here they get into it, right? In the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, the words Israeli or Israel appear more than Palestinian or variations thereof, even as Palestinian deaths far outpaced Israeli deaths. Pretty much all of the Israeli deaths happened on October 7th, right? Since then, we've had thousands and thousands of just children, innocent men, women, children, that have been massacred inside of Gaza. But yet, their coverage of Israelis and Israeli death far outpaces that, even though there's way more on the Palestinian side. They say for every 2 Palestinian deaths, Palestinians are mentioned once. For every Israeli death, Israelis are mentioned 8 times, or at a rate 16 times more per death than that of Palestinians, and they graph that out here. They also get into the actual terminology that is used by these outlets that I've covered numerous different times. They say highly emotive terms for the killing of civilians like slaughter, massacre, and horrific were reserved almost exclusively for Israelis who were killed by Palestinians rather than the other way around. And they say that they, when the terms appeared in quotes rather than editorial voice of the publication, they were omitted from the analysis, right? Which makes sense because they may include some quote and be like, the Gaza Hamas-controlled health ministry said this was a massacre. That doesn't really count because you're not using that terminology. But they say the term slaughter was used by editors and reporters to describe the killing of Israelis versus Palestinians at a 60-to-1 ratio. 60-to-1. And massacre was used to describe the killing of Israelis versus Palestinians 125-to-2. The word horrific was used to describe the killing of Israelis versus Palestinians at 36-to-4 ratio. And they graph that out here as well. I mean, you can see this. New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post. I mean, the LA Times, Washington Post, they didn't use a single time the word slaughter. Okay, almost 30,000 dead Palestinians, 11,000 dead children. They don't use the word slaughter at all because, oh, this is a targeted defensive operation against Hamas. I mean, it is embarrassing. It's grotesque, right? They also say, based on journalists and children that have been primary targets of this war, only 2 headlines out of over 1,100 news articles in the study mentioned the word children related to Gazan children. And a notable exception, the New York Times ran a late November front page story on the historic pace of killings of Palestinian women and children, though the headline featured neither group, right? Despite Israel's war on Gaza being perhaps the deadliest war for children, almost entirely Palestinian in modern history, there is scant mention of the word children and related terms in the headlines of articles surveyed by The Intercept. Now, they didn't actually cover CNN, I don't believe, in this analysis that they were putting together here. But just remember, this was one of the recent articles that I talked about from CNN, right? Of course, they don't mention Israel is responsible for this in the headline. More than 10 children losing legs in Gaza every day as dire health crisis grows, aid groups say. So there's just so much to say about this, right? Aid groups say, you're deferring as if like this isn't the reality. This is, oh, it's just a claim. Maybe it's disputable here, right? More than 10 children losing legs in Gaza. Losing legs as if like, they're just falling off mysteriously. How are they losing the legs? Why are they losing the legs? Who's responsible for them losing the legs? None of this is mentioned, not just in the headline, but also in the body of the text, right? And this headline should say enough in terms of what this war is actually about. I mean, 10 children losing limbs every single day in Gaza. Many of them are having to have amputations due to with no anesthetic due to a lack of medical supplies that Israel is refusing to allow in to the Gaza Strip. And reminder, I covered that Israeli politician in the Knesset, I believe, who came out and straight up said, we should be trying to starve the people of Gaza. We should be withholding, food and water and medical supplies, because then that will help us in our war effort to try to get some people to turn on Hamas or whatever and to become assets for us. They're straight up admitting they're using medical supplies as a weapon, as a tool of the offensive, right? And they don't mention any of this. I mean, I went through and I looked at, where exactly do they even mention Israel in this article? Okay, there's a couple times they do. They mention them when they reference Hamas launching its attack on October 7th on Israel. That's the first time. The second time is down here. The Israeli Defense Forces have repeatedly said that it is not targeting civilians. So in an article that the framing should be Israel is blowing off the legs of up to 10 children a day. Many of them are having to have amputations done without anesthetic because Israel is not allowing adequate medical supplies in. When your average reader goes to this article, they have no idea about that broader context. And the only times you mention Israel in the article is in a defensive manner, is to use October 7th to say, well, maybe this is justified, right? Maybe this makes sense. And then to give a literal IDF defense quote, well, they say they're not targeting civilians. I mean, is this journalism to just be a stenographer for the state of Israel, for the United States government? This is the opposite of what actual journalism is supposed to be in a functioning democracy with a free press. And so we move on to this next one, right? This was from The Column, a blog. Massacred versus Left to Die, documenting media bias against Palestinians, again through a similar period. This one's October 7th through November 7th, right? And they have a couple helpful graphs here, right? Finding number 1, IDF spokesperson Peter Lerner was interviewed 44 times on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News in the span of 30 days and given free rein to mislead and distort with little to no pushback, right? And they map that out there. They also have this: Israelis are mentioned more than Palestinians every day on all of these three major networks here. This remained the case even as Palestinian deaths began to far outpace Israeli deaths. So the more Palestinian death that happens, the less that they're getting covered, okay, relative to the Israeli deaths that have been covered, right? And you see this also mapped out on a similar, graph here, just skyrocketing for the Israelis who are mentioned, barely ticking up here for the Palestinians who are mentioned. And when they do mention the Palestinians, in many circumstances, they're giving a defense of it. They're giving a defense of the offensive into Gaza. They also show it here. Three channels all maintained about the same ratio of Palestine and Israel coverage. I mean, overwhelmingly, regardless if it's the most conservative outlet here, the sort of like self-identified centrist, or even the most leftist outlet here, MSNBC, which does have a few good hosts, one of them being Mehdi Hassan, who was recently pushed out of the network, but other guys like Ayman and Velchi as well are decent on that channel. But I mean, even them, broadly, 82% Israeli. I mean, these are almost identical to each other, right? And other things like here, the news apparently gets to decide what is and is not a massacre, right? Massacres committed on Palestinians. On Fox News, 9 versus 770 committed on Israelis. CNN, 503 on Israelis, only 53 on Palestinians. When we're dealing with a ratio of death here that is about 30 times greater for the Palestinians than the Israelis, right? Again, mentions of Israelis massacred, Palestinians massacred, it barely ever happens. So you guys get the point. And also this ties in, obviously with this recent CNN coverage that I covered on this channel, right? CNN runs Gaza coverage past the Jerusalem team operating under the shadow of an IDF censor, okay? Literally running all of their coverage through the Jerusalem Bureau, where the people working there have the closest ties to the government, the military of Israel, and have an incentive there to then whitewash the coverage. CNN is running all of their shit through this bureau, and also hiring basically like IDF, former soldiers to work on their teams, and also running, a lot of these stories under the shadow of this IDF censor, because believe it or not, this so-called only democracy in the Middle East, right, a beacon of freedom and all that good stuff, they literally censor what the media, even foreign press, is able to cover, okay? So I mean, this is how the media functions. I mean, this is how you manufacture consent for a gruesome genocidal war, as the United States has been doing. And it's not just us, and I'm going to link this down below if you want to go watch Owen Jones' video on this, so credit to him for exposing the same exact thing happening with British media, specifically the BBC. And it's essentially the exact same, exact same numbers that we were just running through with the US media. So again, the reason why this is important is because it is extremely difficult to, number one, get an informed public, and number two, to hold our political, representatives accountable as they are directly, complicit in this ongoing genocidal campaign. It's incredibly difficult to do that when the media is not giving the public an accurate perspective on what is happening. And then they bring on these politicians on their show, they bring on these IDF representatives, and they go easier on them than they do on average Palestinian journalists who are actually being targeted on the ground in Gaza, if they ever allow them on their shows. So I mean, it is vitally important that we continue to try to push back against the narratives that they're pushing. It's vitally important that we continue to try to bolster independent media so that we do have voices out there that are challenging what's happening right now and trying to be that check. But as of right now, the Joe Biden administration is still just going full speed ahead. And part of the reason why he is able to give unchecked, no strings attached support to the state of Israel, to the military of Israel, is because our media is absolutely failing.